Afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Understanding and Mitigating Supply Chain Risks in Today's Environment. Today's webinar is a production of the Virginia Small Business Development Center. With 27 centers across the Commonwealth, we provide training and technical assistance to small businesses. The Virginia SBDC is headquartered at George Mason University and is a program that is a cooperative agreement between the U.S. Small Business Administration, premier institutions across Virginia, and our local governments. My name is Stephanie Keener, and I am the Executive Director for the Virginia SBDC, which serves the city of Lynchburg, Amherst, Appomattox, Bedford, and Campbell counties. We're hosted at the Lynchburg Regional Business Alliance. Today's webinar is the fourth in our series with facilitator Jennifer Woofter on managing a remote business. You can see our other webinars that are upcoming at virginiasbdc.org and click on COVID-19 resources. We're working to add more titles in the coming weeks, so stay tuned. And yes, we will be making the slides and a recording of today's webinar available. And you can find our past episodes at sbdclynchburgregion.org or go to our YouTube channel for the Virginia SBDC and just search on YouTube for Virginia SBDC. Today's facilitator, Jennifer Woofter, is the president and founder of Strategic Sustainability Consulting. She manages a remote workforce across the globe. She also serves as an SBDC advisor for the Virginia SBDC, Lynchburg region, and she's going to share with us the skills for managing a remote workforce, which she's learned over 15 years in the business. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those questions into the chat box. Tracy at our George Mason headquarters will help us facilitate those questions at the end of the session, and Jennifer will do her best to answer them. So Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm going to share my screen, so it will pop up there in just a minute. I'm delighted to be here again with you guys today talking about managing supply chain disruptions, especially when you have to manage those or having very limited presence in our places of business. Really thinking about supply chain continuity is taking on new meaning and new challenges. So let's talk about first, why is supply chain continuity so critical? So according to FEMA, that's our Federal Emergency Management Administration, about half of small businesses never reopen their doors after a disaster, that they end up going out of business or transforming themselves so as to be unrecognizable from the business before the disaster. And that this dramatically increases depending on the number of days that a business is completely closed. In fact, 90% of small companies, according to FEMA, fail within a year unless they can resume operations within 5 business days. Now, that's a complete shutdown. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic is sort of a crazy event that is unexpected, that is massively impacting us all, whether we're a small business or a large business or a nonprofit organization. But the key thing here is that every supplier who shuts their doors causes a supply chain disruption for their customers. And what that means is, even as your business struggles to adapt to a coronavirus situation, not only are you impacting your customers, but your suppliers are being impacted, and their suppliers are being impacted. And so we, especially in a globalized economy where I guarantee you every one of our organizations is buying something from China, we need to be thinking about supply chain, about our businesses, not just as our own, what happens within our 4 walls, but what happens throughout the supply chain. Okay, so there's 2 real ways to manage risk. And this is any kind of risk in your organization. But today we're going to talk about it specifically through the lens of supply chain risk. The 2 strategies are mitigation, that's making the risk less severe or less painful. And the second approach is adaptation, changing your business so that you are less likely to be impacted by that risk going forward. And so when we're in the middle of a crisis or a situation, what our first priority is mitigation. How do we eliminate the pain or reduce the pain as much as possible? But the really important component that we don't want to forget is the adaptation. How do we critically look at our organization, at our business, at our supply chain systems, and help evolve them so that they are less likely to be impacted in the future, and that they're more resilient. They have a greater chance of bouncing back when something bad happens. So let's first talk about like what causes supply chain disruption. And these are the normal everyday things that we talk about as in the business world. The first one is inaccurate planning and forecasting. Like maybe we didn't realize that this thing that we sold was going to be so popular, so we didn't plan to scale up as fast, or maybe we didn't realize that a raw material somewhere back in our supply chain was going to become scarce and the price was going to go way up, and it was going to be passed along to us. So we are facing now a price hike. It could be a whole bunch of different things, but it's really about a lack of planning and foresight on our part. We also have natural disasters and environmental disasters, things like hurricanes, floods, droughts, earthquakes, all of those things that create a physical impact to supply chains. We also have changes in governmental regulation. So this can be things like if you are ordering supplies from Mexico and they're going to cross over at the Mexico border. Now, in the last few years, the Trump administration has implemented new restrictions on trade coming in, and it's delaying the ability of products to get across the border. So making sure that you're accounting for those additional time delays as a result of changes in government regulation is important. We have transportation fluctuations, things like products getting damaged in transit. It can be weather-related transportation delays if the port is shut down for some reason. And it can be things like traffic. All of those things can cause disruptions in your supply chain. We also have geopolitical instability. I think lots of times small businesses think, especially American small businesses, think that that isn't really going to impact them. But we do have global supply chains. If you really look back at what you are bringing in and where that material is coming from, I can guarantee that you have a global supply chain no matter how small your organization is. And really looking at especially in areas in Southeast Asia right now, in China, in Thailand, in places where there is political unrest, whether it's crackdowns on free speech or whether it's uprisings. In China and in Hong Kong, we have seen massive protests. If you are sourcing things from Hong Kong, or you are sourcing things that are somewhere sourced from Hong Kong, component parts, that has had a major disruption for you over the last year. And then increasingly, we are also now seeing cyber attacks as a real cause of supply chain disruption. That's computer hacking, ransomware, data breaches where they come in and steal your information, and maybe it's not yours, but maybe it's happening at a supplier level. All of those are sort of the day-to-day supply chain disruption aspects that a smart business is thinking about how to reduce that risk. But we also have what we call black swan events. And the reason they're called black swans is for years and years and years, like back in the old days, they thought swans could not be black. Swans by definition had to be white. There was no way there was a swan. And then until you saw a black swan, and then it was like, whoa, we totally couldn't have predicted this. This totally changes our opinion, our concept of animal life as we know it. And now we say black swan events. There's a black swan theory. And there's actually a book called Black Swans or Black Swan something, which I read a couple years ago. It was really great. But there's three components to a black swan event. The first one is it's an outlier. It's outside of regular expectations. It's something that the normal person, or even a smart person, someone who's tuned into this, doesn't see coming. It's not part of the regular situation that we're expecting. And it's largely because nothing in our past has prepared us for it, right? We've never seen a black swan before, so I can't even wrap my brain around it. The second aspect is that it has an extreme impact. It really changes the entire way we think about the issue, or the way we run our business, or the way we think the industry operates, or our concept sort of society, of the world. And the third element is that these events are not appropriately incorporated into risk management. We did not plan for it, even though afterwards we say, man, we should have planned for this. Like, the data's there, but we're only using it in hindsight. And so some examples you can see for, I think one of the first ones, for a lot of us, if we're looking back, people who are my age, is 9/11, the terrorist attacks. That retrospectively, we could look around and say, yeah, we should have planned for that. Like, yes, terrorist things happen, but it was happening at a time when the economy was newly globalized. It was on a scale and a precedent that we had not seen before. It had tremendous economic impacts rippling all the way out, and really changed the way society thought and felt. And it had like long-lasting repercussions that we're even facing now today. That's a great example of a black swan event. The SARS outbreak in China, really because so much of our supply chains were coming from China, and then sort of spread. There was a lot of uncertainty there. Hurricane Katrina, the Fukushima earthquake with the nuclear meltdown that happened at Fukushima. Brexit just a couple of years ago, I think people went into it thinking, Britain can't leave the EU. That's just not something that they would do. Why would they do that? Even up until the votes were being counted, there was a sense of disbelief. And then once it happened, people looked back and said, with hindsight, I can see how this would have happened. But it is still having repercussions in Europe and trickling out into the global economy. And of course, the big one that we're all facing right now is the COVID-19 pandemic. So in this session, I want to talk about both things, sort of the regular supply chain disruptions that we need to be planning for and thinking about, we need to be mitigating and adapting to, but also how does that play out in a black swan event like COVID-19? When there's something that's so overwhelming, that's not just impacting our business or our industry, but that is impacting our entire community, our entire supply chain, the entire global economy. How can we adapt traditional supply chain risk reduction techniques to a black swan event? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why COVID-19 specifically is different. And this I pulled from, there's a great article from a professor who teaches supply chain stuff. You can read the whole article at that link below, but this is when he wrote this article, this was one of the graphics that really jumped out to me. And one of the big things that make COVID-19 different from traditional supply chain disruption is just that it is impacting everything. Most of the, if there's an earthquake or a hurricane, the geographical scope is limited. Maybe it's just, it's limited in geography, or it's limited to a particular industry. If we're talking about price hikes or things that are impacted by the price of oil, that can have a ripple effect, but it is largely limited in scope. It's also, the term is that most, the time to recovery, and that's a term that you will find, time to recovery, and that can be days, weeks, or months. For most supply chain disruptions, if it's the port is closed, or there's a hurricane, or there's a new governmental regulation, it's a short-term issue, that the system kind of is disrupted and then it sort of fixes itself. But with black swan events like COVID-19, we are really starting to see a much longer term. People are talking about 18 months for ongoing disruption before we even get back to a sense of normal, whatever normal looks like at that point. And that human behavior and the human impact is different. While maybe you're not personally prepared for a hurricane to come through and destroy your home and building, we have seen it. We have seen it in the news. We have sort of a concept of how that is going to impact us or might impact us personally. We know that there are emergency response systems that are prepared. Sometimes they execute better than others, but they're sort of there and they're ready to respond. Whereas in a pandemic situation, right? We've heard it, we've seen movies about it, we've maybe read a book or thought about how we would react in a pandemic situation. Our actual systems themselves, our healthcare system, our insurance, our business continuity, our supply chain have not been tested. And that creates a lot of uncertainty, and just the level of uncertainty here is so much higher than if we had an earthquake. So I think that those are really kind of helpful things in thinking about why or how to think about normal supply chain risk management in normal situations versus in a black swan event, is that it's bigger and the level of uncertainty is significantly higher. So in this presentation, I wanted to give some specific examples, and I didn't want to just pull randomly, and so I thought, let's pick 3 examples and run them through the entire process. So we're going to look at 3 different things. A consulting company, so I run a consulting company, so I felt very comfortable doing that. I also eat out a lot, so I picked a restaurant, and manufacturing. We work with a lot of manufacturing companies, and I'm pretty familiar with their supply chain models. So as we go through how to understand, assess, mitigate, and adapt to risk, we're going to use these 3 examples. But if you have an example that doesn't sort of fit into this, if you can't identify with a consulting company, this is going to be very similar to a law firm or a graphic design firm or an IT firm, groups that are, or companies or organizations that are providing purely a service. Restaurant can be retail. It's this idea of selling directly to consumers. You are producing a product in-house, but you are largely not sourcing them. You have a wide supplier base. And manufacturing, we're actually thinking about like physically creating something, but maybe selling in a distribution. So maybe you're a B2B, you're selling to a distributor or to a retail establishment. Okay, so the very first step in managing your supply chain risk is understanding who your suppliers are. And the reality is that most of us have much more complicated supply chains than we appreciate. So for example, if you are a merchandiser, so you are creating a t-shirt or a series of t-shirts, or t-shirts and pants, you got something you might go into a clothing store and do, you are going to be buying directly from the manufacturer, like your contract manufacturer who's actually making the t-shirts, but they then are sourcing fabric, they're sourcing thread, they're sourcing ink for dyes, they're sourcing paper tags for the price tag, the little plastic hoop things that connect the paper tag to the t-shirt, and all of those things need to be not just purchased, but they need to be made, they need to be transported, they need to be approved for quality assurance, and all of those things take time, and the great likelihood is that they're not all happening in a common geographical area. So you might have a great example I saw a couple of years ago is that in Sweden, the average cup of yogurt, they eat a lot of yogurt in Sweden, the average single serving cup of yogurt travels 2,400 kilometers before it makes it to your house. That it's, and a yogurt is pretty simple, right? It's cultured dairy in a cup with a foil wrapper on top. Those are 3 components, but they're happening all in different places. Things are getting moved back and forth across borders, back through multiple providers. So really understanding what you're buying and who it is, not just who your main supplier is, that's your tier 1 supplier, that's who you write the check to, but who their suppliers are. Because what we're finding in supply chain disruptions is that it's often not your tier 1 supplier, the person you write the check to, that's having the problem. It's that your tier 1 supplier is having a problem from their suppliers or from those tier 2 suppliers, their suppliers into tier 3. And this idea is you work your way back. A disruption could occur in any one of those supply chain stations and sort of have that trickle down effect to impacting you. So understanding who your suppliers are, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, going all the way back as far as you can. Understanding where they are. Do you know if your product is being made in China or Bangladesh or Thailand? What about the component parts that go into the things that you're buying? It may be, you may be buying it from India, but they may actually be using contract manufacturers in Vietnam. Or things like that. Talking to your suppliers and understanding who your suppliers are and where they are is going to be incredibly important for understanding what type of risk you are exposed to. And we'll talk about that more in a second. The third element is when. You need to know when your supplies are at different stages in the supply chain. So for example, if you know that let's go back to the t-shirt example. The t-shirt sits in the warehouse for up to a week before it's shipped to you, and you're going to sell it in your store. But before that, it spends 30 days on a cargo ship getting from the warehouse, or getting to the warehouse from the contract manufacturer in Bangladesh. So you need to know that if there's a problem in Bangladesh, you may be 30 days out planning for that cargo ship duration. And so understanding who, the where, and the when your supplies are in each stage in the product life cycle is going to be really important for understanding how exposed you are and understanding, as you see, there's a hurricane in Bangladesh, drought in Thailand, and Brexit in Britain. Understanding those things, if you don't know where your suppliers are, you don't know who your suppliers are, it's going to be very difficult to know if a particular supply chain issue is going to impact you. So how do you do that? The first step is to identify your suppliers if you haven't already. Start with your accounting records. If you use QuickBooks or something like that, go back and look at everybody that you've written a check to in the last 2 years. If you have more than 30 people, 30 vendors, and you probably will, prioritize them. Prioritize them by how much you spend. So anything that you've spent more than $100 on or $1,000 on, figure out what is a lot to you, and that will depend largely on the size of your business, the type of your business. Look also for things that you're purchasing frequently. Maybe you only purchased, maybe the average purchase is quite small, but you're purchasing regularly from them. You need an ongoing stock of whatever the item is. And the third element is things that are really integral to your product or service. A great example here in the automotive industry is O-rings. So, and they like go on valves. That the cost of an O-ring in the wider scope of a vehicle is very, very small, you know, like cents on the dollar. But if O-rings aren't there, it completely shuts down. Like you cannot make a car without O-rings. And so this is one where it's not a high spend. They're maybe not purchasing it that frequently, maybe 2 or 3 times a year to, you know, they purchase in bulk. But if it's not there, the product cannot be finished or the service cannot be delivered. So use those 3 categories to identify your top vendors. And I would say go for maybe 30 to 50. Anything more than 50 is going to be overwhelming to do, but at least get them down and then group them into categories. So you might say, okay, these are all of our food vendors. These are all of our raw material vendors. These are all of our travel providers. These are all of our office supply vendors. Grouping them into categories is going to help you in the next step. Okay, so in our examples of consulting, restaurant, manufacturing, these are the ones that I found are going to be the most popular. Now, again, you might have 30 or 50, you might have 200. I didn't want to go through all of that, so I just picked a handful for our examples here. But for consulting, for my business, I have 2 major categories of vendors. The first one is IT, so that's like internet services, file access like Dropbox, and like the actual programs that I use on the computer, like Microsoft and things like that. And the second category is travel. I do a lot of travel in my company. My consultants do a lot of travel. So airlines, hotel, car rental are all really important. That's probably where we spend the most amount of our money in our supply chain. In a restaurant, it's going to be totally different. They're going to be looking primarily at the food that they are serving. So fresh food, other food, linens, things like tablecloth napkins, server uniforms, packaging, and utilities. So making sure that the facility is actually up and running, that the stove turns on when you flip the switch. Manufacturing, it's going to be raw materials, but in a different way. So in this imaginary example, I decided that there were 3 main raw materials: a resin, like a plastic resin, paper and pulp materials for some sort of paper thing, and a widget that's like a well, it's a widget. It's a thing that they're buying that someone else is making for them, that they then incorporate into their assembled product. They also have equipment, and that's really 2 components. It's both the machines that they use to do their manufacturing, but it is also the service to maintain those machines. And then packaging, so cardboard, thin film, pallets, all the things they need in order to package and ship their products. So these supplier examples, I might go through and say, in those categories, who are my top suppliers? Who are they? Where are they located? Where are they getting their stuff? And when does it go through each stage of the supply chain? So for a restaurant, you might be working directly with a specific farm for your fresh food, right? Like, I know the lettuce is being grown 10 miles away at farm X, and that's a very short supply chain. Whereas, for a consulting travel, maybe it's United Airlines and American Airlines and occasionally JetBlue. Identifying who those are, where they are they global, are they local? Are they providing the services themselves? Are they contracting that out? Are they developing their own raw materials, or are they sourcing them from some other place? If you don't know right now, just put a little question mark. Don't worry about tracking it down for each and every single one of your suppliers, because right now that's going to be overwhelming. You have enough going on, and even once the coronavirus has passed, that will still be too much. It will be too time consuming. So right now, just write down what you know, and then move on to the next step, which is to assess your disruption risks. And this is where we want to identify the probability. How likely is it that there will be a supply chain disruption? And what are the consequences of that disruption? So the consequences might be that my cost to fill that need is going to go way up. And think about the need being like, if my internet goes out, I might have to pay to bring in a satellite, or my data charges for my phone might be really high if I have to work from a hotspot. There might be cost implications. There also might be scheduling implications. If I'm traveling, if a huge part of my consulting business is traveling and the airlines are shut down, right? Like, I no longer can get places, that is going to dramatically impact my schedule. It may also include technical performance. If you're a restaurant and you can't serve a salad because you don't have lettuce, that is a technical performance issue. You are technically not able to perform the product, or deliver the product or service that your brand promises. And the 4th element is a reputation. Is there going to be, maybe you can deliver a salad, but if it doesn't have lettuce, or you're using maybe spinach now or something like that, you may incur reputational issues. If the quality is not as good, if the price suddenly goes up, if you're constantly out of things on your menu, you may have a reputational issue there. So here's how you actually score that. So let's take it from a conceptual idea to an actual quantitative process base. So here's the example of consulting. And here, down the left side, I've put my categories: airlines, hotel, car rental. Those are my travel categories. And then sort of IT, internet, file access, computer programs. Those are the things that are, again, your list will be longer, but these are the ones I've picked for the purposes of our example. Okay, so we're looking for disruption that makes it impossible or extremely inconvenient to secure the product or service that I need, whether that's a flight across the country, whether it's a night in a hotel, whether it's access to my files that I've stored in the cloud. That's the type of disruption that we are looking for when we say likelihood of disruption. And then essentially in each cell, I'm going to score it from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest risk or the highest impact to business. And then across the table, what I want to do is I'm going to multiply the likelihood of disruption. I'm going to multiply that times the sum of the consequences. So that's cost plus schedule plus performance plus reputation. So let's take an example of airlines. So I'm going to say the likelihood of disruption is a 2. It doesn't happen very often that I'm unable, that my flight is canceled or my flight is delayed such that I can't get where I'm going that when I need to get there, like the same day. Or in like examples like COVID-19 is very unusual that, you know, international flights just wholeheartedly get shut down. But when I do, the cost goes way up, that I may have to pay exorbitant change fees. In certain circumstances, I may need to do something radical. One time I actually had, this is extreme. One time I actually had to charter a plane to get where I needed to go. So the cost for me, the cost impact or the cost consequences of when airlines, when there's a severe disruption is pretty high for me. It significantly impacts my schedule. It's the highest impact. It really impacts my performance. The delivery of my consulting services can't happen if I'm not there. And it can have a huge reputation impact for me. Okay, compare that to file access down here. That, you know, file access, sometimes I can't get to it if I use Dropbox or things like that, but the cost is not that big. I could just move to a different one. I have things backed up. So yeah, the cost is not a big thing. Scheduling, it's a little bit, but I mean, I might have to take an extra couple of days to deliver a project or send files. It sort of impacts the performance a little bit, and it doesn't really impact my reputation. There's enough workarounds that I can find that. And so what you see is that your total score here for airlines versus file access is quite different. So you can see in this category, my top 3 most riskiest suppliers are going to fall into the categories of airlines, hotel, and internet for me. Okay, so look at the next one, which is our restaurant. So here again, I pulled the ones from the previous example. This is a handful of the suppliers that a restaurant would actually have. But what you see is that produce, meat, and dairy, let's look at those. The likelihood of disruption to them is roughly the same. You know, it doesn't happen that often. But the cost, meat is, I know from my experience working with restaurants, is that when meat is not available, your alternatives get very, very pricey. That's the one where the price jumps the most when there is scarcity. Produce to a lesser extent, and dairy to, you know, a tertiary extent. They all kind of impact the schedule. Can I still open for dinner? Can I deliver, you know, produce the food at the time I wanted to? What I know from performance is that the quality, having the produce and the meat that I want, that I'm used to dealing with, is really, really important to the performance, the delivery of the food to the customer. Dairy, less so. People are much less likely to notice if I'm using one milk versus another milk, or one butter versus another butter, as opposed to the quality of meat or the quality of produce. And reputation, same deal. So what you see is that meat ends up being our highest score, followed by produce, and it's actually electricity turns out to be the 3rd one. If I'm in an area that has frequent blackouts, especially during the summer, that is something that the likelihood, even though the overall risk, if you look across this bottom, the level of consequences is much lower, the frequency or the likelihood of disruption is higher, and that then bumps up your total score. So even though if it happens, the consequences of a disruption in produce, meat, and dairy are much higher. The fact that the electricity goes out more frequently than my meat supplier is disrupted balances that out. So you're really looking at both issues. Okay, and let's just look at the 3rd one, manufacturing. Again, we have resin, paper pulp, widgets, machinery, equipment service, electricity, and cardboard. What we see here is that, like, resin, because it has the biggest cost impact, resin is like our primary product. If it is disrupted, it is going to be a major snafu. Widgets and then equipment service is another one where maybe I have failed to forecast that the equipment service technician organization that I work with, our supplier who comes in and fixes the machines when they're broken, I don't know, he just retired and there's not a good replacement, or the prices have dramatically gone up and now there's a price shock for me. This is another one where the machinery is really expensive, but the equipment, if the equipment is not serviced, I cannot continue manufacturing. And so what we see is that in this example, our resin, our widgets, and our equipment service are our top 3 riskiest supply chains. Okay, so now that we kind of understand what our top priorities are, right? Those are the ones you want to start in the areas that have the highest risk. Now we want to look at how do we mitigate that risk. And there's 4 mitigation approaches. The first one is you accept it. You're like, oh, well, it sucks, but that's the way it is. We're only going to go with that if we can't do one of the other 3. The first one is avoid. Can we avoid the risk altogether? Can we just take ourselves out of that supply chain? The second one is, can we transfer the risk? Can we get someone else to bear the burden of the risk? So for example, if in my consulting, if I get to the airport and all my flights are canceled and the only way to do it is to buy a new ticket on a different airline, do I have to bear that cost, or have I written it into my contract so that my client pays the cost, reimburses me for the cost of any extraordinary travel disruptions? So that would be an example of transferring the risk away from me onto my client. The third or the fourth mitigation approach is to reduce the risk. So are there things that we can do within the existing supply chain that just make the likelihood and reduce the consequences of a disruption happening? Okay, so let's go back to our examples. So for consulting, right, here's my top 3 categories are internet, airlines, hotel. For the internet, I can avoid that by using cellular hotspot capability, so that when there is a disruption, I can just pick myself up and stop relying on the internet temporarily until the disruption is resolved. By having hotspot capability, everyone can run, you know, stuff from their phones on their data plans if they need to. I can't really transfer I couldn't think of an example where I would transfer the risk. But I can also reduce the risk or reduce the impact or the consequences of internet disruptions by, instead of having everything purely stored on the cloud, by doing a hard drive backup, so that it may be inconvenient, but I still am going to have access to my stuff if there is a disruption. For airlines, it's sort of similar. I can avoid airlines during a disruption by taking the train. I can reduce my risk by having multiple approved airlines, and I can also transfer the risk again by having my client, in my contract, by having my client pay for part or all of the disruption costs. And that's something that you may find your customers asking you to take on more risk. Right? This is something that is not just you doing to other people, but other people may be trying to do to you. This is one, though, we're spreading the risk. This is something where in some of my contracts, so I know there's going to be a lot of travel, we sort of have a provision that we share the risk. So if it's a $200 change fee as a result of a delay or a cancellation or something like that, I pay 50% and the client pays 50%. So it's not, the burden is not falling on either of us completely. So same thing for hotels. There's, a variety of options that you can do. Okay, for restaurant now, keep in mind their top 3 categories are produce, meat, and electricity. You can't avoid produce unless you're only serving meat and dairy, I guess. You need produce, so you can't completely avoid that. You can transfer. You may do a shared cost or consequence with vendors, like if the supply is more than 24 hours late, we get a 5% discount or something like that. Some idea of incentivizing your supplier to, they either get bonuses for performing, or there is a consequence or a reduction in fee for disruption. You can also reduce it by having secondary suppliers ready to go. So you're not just relying on the one supplier for your produce, but maybe you have 2 or 3 other options. You may also do something where you're doing frozen alternatives. So instead of fresh spinach, you're going to make sure that there's a reserve of frozen spinach in the back freezer to sort of get you through that interim bump. Meet sort of the same idea. You can increase your in-house inventory so that you've got a longer period of time. Identifying secondary suppliers. Electricity, you could have a backup generator, so you're not reliant on the grid during those small and short-term interruptions. For longer term things, you may have disruption insurance, that if the electricity is out for more than a certain amount of time, you could actually recoup that. And that's something that sometimes is included in standard business insurance, and sometimes it is an extra add-on that you would look at, largely dependent on your industry and your insurance provider. Okay, so let's look at manufacturing. So same thing, is this idea of incentives for continuity or disincentives for disruption with your suppliers. You may choose to increase your in-house inventory, that instead of having 7 days of widgets on hand in the back room, we're now going to go for 21 days so that we're better able to address the fact that there's a slowdown in deliveries across the Mexican border. For equipment service, we're concerned that like when we need our equipment service, the guy has retired, or they're slower to respond, or it's instead of being able to show up, on the day that we need it, it's a week out to schedule an appointment to have our machinery serviced. You can avoid that, needing that supply chain, by training your personnel in-house, training them or hiring someone who can do service that is directly on your payroll. You can also, if you're doing that as sort of a supplemental, you're reducing it, right? That we're still going to rely on that third party for our big stuff, but we're going to train someone to just do sort of like the daily maintenance. Or you could completely remove in that avoid category, completely remove yourself by having an on-site person who can do it all. Okay, so those are sort of like mitigation techniques, right? Like we can reduce, we can transfer the risk, we can avoid the risk completely. But now how do we change our business model to adapt to supply chain risk? So as, for example, as we see an increase in extreme weather as a result of climate change, that is something that, like, yes, we can mitigate for or have a plan for an individual hurricane, but now if we're seeing increasing amounts of weather-related disruptions across the board, we need to actually change our business model so that we're ready for a world and a supply chain that is going to more regularly have hurricanes. And there's 4 real categories of adaptation approaches. The first one is stockpiling your inventory. So again, going from 7 days of widgets in the back room to 21 days. That works better for some things than others. You may, if you are a restaurant that specializes in seafood, fresh seafood, you don't want to have 21 days of flounder in the back, right? That's not going to be an option. But going through and identifying what your key supplies are, especially, tangible supplies, and identifying, are there particular items of your physical inventory that are more at risk of disruption, and increasing the inventory and the stockpile on those is a key way to minimize your disruption. The second element is diversifying your supply base. This is making sure that if you have critical suppliers, so if you're a manufacturer and you need that widget, that you are not just buying the widget, or you don't just have one approved vendor for that widget. Maybe you have 2 or 3. Maybe you only buy from vendor number 1, but you have vendors 2 and 3 identified, you have contracts in place, they understand they're the backup, that you have it ready to go so that when there is a disruption, you can immediately implement a secondary vendor process. You may also want to eliminate high-risk vendors or high-risk items. So, for example, if you know, I'm trying to think of a good example. Okay, so for example, if you know that, man, we keep having E. coli breakouts in romaine lettuce. Like that's one that like over the last couple of years, we've had a lot of E. coli concerns with romaine lettuce. It keeps cropping up in different places. You might decide, okay, in my restaurant, we're just not going to have romaine salads from now on. Like that's just, I'm not confident that there's any way to secure that supply chain. And I just, it's really impacting our, you know, our confidence, our ability to project and things like that. We're just going to like only do spinach salads from now on. Going through and seeing, are there specific vendors? If you have a vendor in Hong Kong right now, with all of the upheaval, you might say, you know what, right now we don't want to be buying from anyone in Hong Kong. Like there's just too much geopolitical uncertainty. Identifying, are there key risk factors for individual suppliers or for categories of suppliers? The third approach is to manage your product demand. So this is evolving your products and services. If you're a restaurant in COVID-19 and you are totally freaked out and you shut down your in-house restaurant and you're just doing delivery now, why offer your full menu? if you're you know, your numbers are down, your customers are down, go to a slimmer menu so that you are having to source fewer products during this time of uncertainty. That is going to reduce the amount of spoilage that you have. It's going to make it simpler for the production process, so you're not having to have 6 sauces going on, you know, being heated up at the same time if you're just, you know, going down to 2 sauces. For a consultant like me, it's things like shifting our workshops from in-person to online, right? Or doing these webinars. The SBDC historically has had a lot of like lunch to learns where we all come in and we all share lunch together and we all talk in real time. Moving to a webinar basis is a way to evolve your products and services to mitigate and adapt to this new reality. And the fourth component is strengthening your core supply chain. So this is making sure that your supply chain people, and that might be, if you're a really small business and you're the owner, you might be the supply chain personnel. If you are a mid-sized business or somebody who specifically works just in purchasing, making sure that they have the appropriate education, training, and insight into the purchasing process and the supply chain selection and risk and disruption components, really making sure that they are well prepared to do that. A second element is modifying your vendor and client contracts. Make sure that if there is a disruption that the client project doesn't completely go away, right? Can you get more money up front rather than if you are completely a cash on delivery model, can you get people to pay up front? That's a big thing that's impacting my business right now is I offer sustainability consulting, and that's in a pandemic situation where everyone is completely freaked out. People are not like, wow, how can we go green during this time? So a lot of the projects that I have previously contracted with clients have just been postponed indefinitely. They've said, come back to us in 4 to 6 weeks. We still want to do this, but we don't want to do this now. And what's really saved me is that my client contracts include a high percentage of, you know, they're paying 50% upfront before the project even began. So I have some cash in the bank to kind of get me through this time. It's not a perfect solution, but it has minimize the immediate impact of a huge disruption in my business. Changing your payment terms, making it, again, more money up front, a closer, you know, instead of net 90, maybe it's net 30. Keep in mind, it's not just you doing this to other people. Your clients may be doing, or your customers may be wanting to do this to you as well. So be aware about how that risk mitigation strategies go both ways. Is someone asking you to take on more risk, and how does that impact your business model? Okay, so let's look at some examples. So for me, for consulting, that's creating more virtual events, including training and making sure that my people are well equipped to deliver virtual events. It's also looking at developing a passive stream of income. Are there things that I can do that don't rely on me being actively on the internet, accessing files and things like that? Can there be things that people, workbooks that sit on my website that people can buy, you know, in the middle of the night, things that are going to generate income all the time? For a restaurant, the biggest risks are food, obviously, and power, electricity specifically. So this is one where like creating a modified menu and not just for like COVID-19, but in any situation, if there was an earthquake or if there was a hurricane or if the cost of steak triples overnight because of some cow dilemma, like what's your alternative? Having already identified what are your best sellers, what's easiest to make, what are the supplies that are the easiest to get, allows you to really quickly switch over when there is a disruption in place. And then that may also accompany increasing inventory of key supplies. Like we know, regardless of what happens in the world, people want our dinner rolls. And we can use dinner rolls for sandwich bread, we can use it for that. So we're going to increase the amount of inventory we have for dinner rolls, things like that. And for manufacturing, their biggest risks are raw materials and equipment service. So that might be, again, increasing inventory of widgets or resin or whatever it is. But it may also be starting to train in-house personnel on maintenance, simple maintenance procedures so that you're not so reliant on external service providers. Okay, so that's sort of like the big picture of the process. You should be able to apply this thinking and these steps regardless of what industry that you're in. If you are a small retail shop, if you are an IT firm, if you are, like whatever kind of business you are, going through those steps should work. If you are really thinking about just overall business risk management, specifically focusing on supply chain though, here are some short-term actions that you can look at. I love this. This was just like a quick blog entry from KPMG, the big consulting firm. They were looking at what are the short and long-term things your business should be doing to address COVID-19 in your supply chain. And the first one was forming a crisis response team, making sure you've identified in your team who's going to be doing this, like who's responsible for communications, who's responsible for evaluating suppliers, who's going to call the suppliers, who's going to change the menu, who's going to update the website. If you're a very small business, you might be the crisis response team, and that is okay. But think about like who's going to do what and what are the different tasks that need to be done. Identifying what are the most material critical things. Is it your widget? Is it the internet? Is it the electricity's going out? Is it that our clients aren't paying? Figuring out what the most important short-term immediate needs are, and then developing a contingency plan. Looking at different scenarios. What happens if we're back up and running in 4 weeks? What happens if this is still happening 18 months from now? Figuring out how long, and using a couple examples rather than just sitting in uncertainty and thinking, gosh, I don't even know how, like feeling that analysis paralysis because there's so much uncertainty. Pick a couple different scenarios and see how things change. That will at least give you an idea of the different levers that you can pull depending on what happens when. And there's a couple other examples here. Again, we're going to make the slides available to you after. You can take some time and actually read the articles themselves. In mid to long-term actions, this is where we're talking more about that adaptation. Really looking at making sure when you bring on a new supplier that you are thinking critically about who are they? Where are they getting their stuff from? When does it hit every stage of the delivery process? Making sure that there's diversification. Right now, you may be just like treading water to stay above the water line. But going forward, making sure that as you are thinking about new products, new services, new suppliers, that you're thinking, should I be, and can I rely solely on a single supplier for this product? Are there alternatives easily available to me? So for airlines, that's no big deal, right? Like I can fly on 15 different airline providers. But maybe the widgets that I need are only produced by 2 companies in the world. What does that mean for my supply chain continuity? So all of these are some really great examples. I'm also putting in some additional resources, some things from FEMA, some things from Harvard Business Review, some things for Deloitte, some things from World Economic Forum. I wanted to point out the last two, if you are really struggling with understanding or wrapping your arms around how COVID-19 is going to impact your specific industry, the second to last bullet point, this COVID-19 coronavirus industry exposure tool, allows you to choose your specific industry and then choose the country that you're in, or the country that you source primarily from, and it gives you sort of a summary of what's happening, what's being disrupted, how fast it is expected to resolve. That is being updated on a regular basis, so I think that's a great tool. What I will say about this is we all deal with crisis differently. Some people want to spend hours really diving into all the nitty-gritty, like what are the best practices in supply chain management, and others are going to not want that. And I would really encourage you to know yourself. Spend some time thinking about, for your organization and for your business, what kind of leader do you need to be right now, and what kind of grace do you need to give yourself? If you want to dive into these resources now, go for it. If looking at this list feels overwhelming, don't even open any of them. Think just about the slides that we've gone through and what are the intermediate steps. Figuring out who your most important suppliers are. Figuring out how you can reduce the risk. So remember, can I avoid the risk? Is there a complete alternative I could do? Could I transfer the risk to someone else who could help share the burden? Or can I reduce the risk by doing something now that is going to make it easier to get through those bumps? And again, remember, your Small Business Development Center is a great resource for coaching. You can, we'll spend a couple minutes here doing Q&A, but if you're really feeling like you just need to talk to somebody one-on-one who can listen to your unique situation and give you some feedback, contact the Small Business Development Center, because they can set you up with a coach who can sit down with you one-on-one and work through some of this, because it can be very overwhelming. All right, with that, we're going to go to Q&A. Tracy, do we have any questions that have come in?
We do have one. In a consulting business, do you have 30 suppliers or much less as a service?
So I actually ran this. I have like, in the last year, I think I had 67 vendors that I had directly written a check to. So, but a lot of that thing, it was like Office Depot when I ran out of paper one day and I needed just a ream of paper. It was also, Depot Grill in downtown Lynchburg that I went, and when I took an intern there to go eat lunch, we had like our celebratory thing that was a business expense. So it was a lot of people that maybe I used once. When I talk about my main vendors, the ones that I am significantly spending money with, it really was like my utilities, like my electricity bill, my rent. It was my airline travel over the last year, hotels, car rental. I mean, that was probably maybe a dozen, maybe 15 vendors. It was not a lot that I really identified as like, I needed them. The rest were like a restaurant, but I could go to any restaurant, or there's lots of places to buy a ream of paper downtown, or I could order it from Amazon, things like that. So you will find, if you run that list, it is likely to be very, very long when you run it from your QuickBooks or your accounting software. But once you start to narrow it down, I think that you're probably going to find that you have a couple dozen.
Okay. Well, we don't have any other questions. So Stephanie, I'll turn it over to you to close this out.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself there for a second. It's the Zoom issue, right? We all forget to unmute ourselves. I will put that final slide up as a separate PDF so that you can click through those great resources. I'll get to that a little bit more quickly than we will have the video up. So if you just come to Virginia, if you come to spdclynchburgregion.org, you should find that in just 20 or 30 minutes or so. And it is 1:15 now. So as I said, we'll have all the slides and recording for today's topic up on the website soon, and all the previous topics are already up there. So if you need to, gently have someone watch hiring virtually, or have them take a look at tips and tricks for working from home, don't hesitate to share those. We are in conversation about what our next topics are. We did want to kind of take a break and think through, what are the topics that, now that we're a couple of weeks into this, that we think really make the most sense right now. So we will get those titles to you soon. You will be able to register for those at sbdclynchburgregion.org. Make sure you follow us on Facebook to get the latest posting about those at Virginia SBDC or SBDC Lynchburg Region. And you can see all the recorded training we have to offer by searching for Virginia SBDC on YouTube. Thanks a lot. Everybody stay home and safe and wash your hands. See you soon.